This photograph was taken in the final months of World War II. The exact date is unclear. The photographer is unknown. The village appears ordinary. Quiet stone houses, a church tower, children playing nearby. And yet something is terribly wrong. 5 women stand in the middle of the street, perfectly aligned. They wear identical uniforms. Their hands cover their mouths. Not screaming, not speaking, as if silence itself has been ordered. Behind them, British flags hang openly. Civilians go about their lives. No rubble, no smoke, no visible war. So who are these women? Why are they here? Unarmed, exposed, frozen in place. What did they just see? Or what were they just told? And most unsettling of all, if this was taken during wartime, why does nothing in this image look like war at all? March 1945. Shropshire, England. 6 German women prisoners stepped onto a village street that should not exist. The lorry stopped with a soft hiss of brakes, not the screech they expected. No shouted orders followed. No rifle butts struck the wooden sides. When the tailgate dropped, what greeted them was not rubble or smoke, but morning. Pale sunlight rested on stone cottages the color of honey. A narrow road ran between hedgerows clipped into patient lines. A grocer's door stood open, a bell chiming as a woman entered with a basket on her arm. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang the hour, clear, steady, unhurried. The sound made them flinch. They stepped down one by one, boots touching clean pavement instead of broken glass. The air smelled of damp earth and bread. Not ash, not cordite, not the sour smoke that had followed them from Tunisia to Sicily, from Italy to the holding camps. Children ran past at the end of the lane, chasing one another, laughing too loudly, as if laughter itself had not been rationed by war. A man leaned against a bicycle, nodding to a neighbor. Curtains stirred in open windows. Life moved on without noticing them. I stood still, my hands clenched at my sides, waiting for the second act to begin, waiting for the shouting, waiting for the punishment that must surely follow a deception this elaborate. Villages did not look like this in wartime. We knew that. We had been taught it from the beginning. We had been told England was starving, that America hoarded food while Europe collapsed, that the enemy's cities were hollowed-out shells, their people desperate, their streets ruled by anger and chaos. We had been told the civilians hated us, feared us, would spit if they dared. We had been told that capture meant humiliation, cruelty, disappearance. For women, something worse, something never spoken aloud. Instead, the village breathed. A shopkeeper arranged apples in a neat pyramid behind glass. A postman crossed the street with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. A girl skipped rope near a garden gate, counting under her breath. The church bell rang again, and this time no one reacted at all. It was simply the sound of the hour, as ordinary as footsteps. I felt something shift in my chest, a pressure that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with confusion. We stood there in our gray uniforms, seams worn thin, buttons mismatched from replacements taken wherever they could be found. North Africa had bleached us. Italy had broken us. We carried ourselves the way we had been trained, back straight, eyes forward, but there was no formation that could make sense of what we were seeing. The wire, the guard towers, the shouted commands we understood. This calm, was incomprehensible. A woman across the street met my eyes. She did not glare. She did not look away. She simply looked, the way one looks at a passing weather change, curious and then already moving on. I realized she was holding a loaf of bread wrapped in paper. The weight of it seemed obscene. Bread existed here, in daylight, unhidden. Behind me, one of the women whispered my name. Her voice trembled, not with terror, but with something like disbelief. I did not answer. I could not find words that would fit the scene. We began to walk, escorted but not hurried, down the street. Our boots sounded too loud. Every step felt like an intrusion. I watched faces as we passed, some guarded, some neutral, some simply tired. No one shouted, no one threw anything. A few children stopped to stare until a woman called them back with a quiet word, as if our presence were a breach of manners rather than a provocation. My mind reached for what it knew, for the lessons that had shaped it. Wartime meant sirens. Wartime meant empty shelves and broken windows. Wartime meant people bent inward by hunger and fear. Wartime meant hatred sharpened by loss. That was the world I understood. That was the world I had left behind in ruins. But here the shops were open. The streets were clean. The gardens were planted. The bell rang, and people listened without fear. I remembered a lecture from years earlier, a map pinned to a wall, arrows sweeping confidently westward. I remembered the certainty in the voice that told us the enemy's strength was a lie, that their societies were soft, decadent, already collapsing. I remembered believing it because belief was required, because doubt was dangerous, because doubt made the war harder to bear. The village did not argue. It did not need to. It existed. As we passed the school, I saw a chalkboard through an open window, numbers written in a careful hand. A child's coat hung on a peg by the door. Someone had planted bulbs along the path, green shoots pushing up through cold soil. They had planned for spring. They believed in it enough to prepare. I felt suddenly unsteady, as if the ground itself had shifted. Not from beneath my feet, but beneath everything I thought I knew. If this was England in March of 1945, if this was the enemy we had been fighting, then the war I carried in my head no longer matched the world in front of my eyes. We were supposed to be walking through collapse. We were supposed to confirm the stories. Instead, each step unraveled them. The bell rang again, closer now, and a man paused to check his watch. Somewhere, a door closed softly. Life adjusted around us without breaking. I understood then that whatever awaited us beyond this street, behind fences and rules and watches, something irreversible had already happened. If this was wartime, I wondered, feeling the question take shape before I could stop it, then what were we told the war looked like? Before there was England, there was sand. There was the heat of North Africa that never truly faded, even at night. Canvas tents snapping in dry wind. Flies settling on everything that stayed still too long. Field hospitals pitched and repitched as the front moved, then collapsed, then moved again. We learned to sleep in fragments, to eat quickly, to work without looking up. Pain had a rhythm there. So did death. I had been a nurse before the war, trained, orderly, precise. Others among us had been teachers, clerks, radio operators. Women who knew how to keep records straight, who knew how to calm a frightened child or transmit a message without error. The war took those skills and fed them into chaos. In Tunisia, we worked until our hands shook. In Sicily, we learned to triage without hope. In Italy, the wounded arrived faster than we could register them, faster than we could save them. By the time the retreat began, discipline had thinned into habit. Then habit broke. Orders contradicted each other. Columns crossed in panic. Vehicles burned on roads that no longer led anywhere. We passed men who had stopped asking questions, whose eyes no longer followed movement. Somewhere between Anzio and the mountains, the war we had been promised, the orderly one, the inevitable one. simply vanished. Capture came quietly. There was no heroic last stand, no dramatic confrontation. Just exhaustion so deep that when voices called out in a language we barely understood, no one ran. Hands went up because they could no longer stay down. The fighting had drained out of us long before the enemy arrived. After that, time lost its shape. We moved through holding areas, through makeshift camps in Italy, through processing centers where names were taken and possessions inventoried. We were searched, deloused, counted. We slept on floors and benches and wherever space allowed. We learned the sound of unfamiliar boots, the cadence of foreign speech. Every step carried us farther from what we knew and closer to what we feared. Because fear had been prepared for us long before capture. We had been taught what America was, what England was, not as places, but as threats. They told us the Americans were brutal because they were undisciplined, that without proper order, men became animals, that their morality was shallow, their culture corrupt. They told us Americans treated prisoners as trophies or tools, not as people. That women were especially vulnerable, that female captives were humiliated to make examples, used to prove a point, erased quietly when they became inconvenient. England, we were told, was worse in a different way. Cold, vengeful, starving. A nation propped up by lies, held together by resentment and fear. Its people, they said, had been bombed into madness. They would look at us and see only what they had lost. We were warned not to expect mercy. Mercy, they said, was a German weakness that the enemy did not share. These lessons were repeated until they settled into the body. They did not feel like opinions. They felt like facts, as solid as anatomy. You did not argue with them any more than you argued with gravity. So we learned to be afraid in specific ways. Not loud fear, quiet fear, the kind that stays in the stomach and tightens when you hear footsteps outside a tent, the kind that measures every glance, every word spoken aloud. We feared being separated, because separation meant vulnerability. We feared being noticed, because notice could turn into interest, and interest into something that could not be undone. We feared disappearance most of all. In the war, we had seen what happened to those who slipped out of records, who were transferred without explanation, who did not return. We had learned not to ask where they went. Asking was dangerous. Silence was safer. At night, lying shoulder to shoulder on straw or bare boards, we spoke in whispers. We traded rumors the way others traded cigarettes. Some had heard stories from the Eastern Front of camps where fear was the point, where violence was routine. Others spoke of reprisals, of collective punishment, of prisoners beaten to enforce obedience. These stories were never confirmed, but they did not need to be. They aligned too well with what we had been taught. The enemy, we believed, would behave as enemies did. By the time we boarded the transport that would take us north, then west, then across water, the fear had hardened into expectation. It was easier that way. Expectation hurt less than hope. The journey blurred together, trains, ports, the low constant thrum of engines. We crossed landscape we could not place, slept in holds that smelled of oil and bodies, counted days by meals and head counts. Some of the women grew thinner. Some grew quieter. All of us learned to watch without reacting. When we were told we were being sent to England, a ripple passed through us that no one acknowledged aloud. England meant the final proving ground of everything we had been told. Whatever happened there would confirm the truth of the war we carried inside us. We arrived in winter, though it did not look like winter as we understood it. The cold was damp, penetrating, without the clean edges of snow. The camp where we were first held was orderly. Too orderly, we thought. Order could be a mask. Cleanliness could be preparation. We waited for the rules to reveal their cruelty. They did not. That absence unsettled us more than violence would have. Guards spoke when they needed to, and not when they did not. Food arrived on schedule. Medical inspections were conducted without comment. We were assigned numbers, tasks, routines. The structure was clear, impersonal, and, most disturbing of all, predictable. Predictability did not fit the lessons we had learned. Still, we did not trust it. Trust was a luxury for people with choices. We watched for signs. A delay that might mean punishment, a look held too long, a rule enforced too harshly. We prepared ourselves for the moment when the mask would drop. That moment, we believed, would come when we were exposed to civilians. Civilians were unpredictable. Civilians carried grief without uniforms. Civilians, we had been taught, were where hatred lived. So when we were told we would walk through a village, escorted but visible, the fear returned in full, not as panic, but as a tightening that made breathing deliberate. We checked our buttons, smoothed our hair, arranged our faces into something neutral. Not defiant, not inviting, invisible, if possible. Because if America and England were cruel, this was where it would show. This was where the war we had been taught would finally reveal itself. And we stepped forward believing, truly believing, that whatever waited beyond the gate would justify every warning we had been given. The camp did not look like the places we feared. There were fences, yes, wires stretched in clean lines, gates that opened and closed on schedule. Guard posts stood at measured intervals, not looming, not aggressive. The buildings were plain, wood and stone, functional rather than imposing. Nothing about the place suggested improvisation. It felt planned, deliberate, as if it had been designed by people who expected it to last. We were assembled in a hall that smelled faintly of soap and damp wool. An interpreter stood to one side, a clipboard tucked under his arm. When the officer entered, no one shouted for attention. The room simply settled, the way classrooms did before lessons began. She was not what we expected. A woman, middle-aged, her posture straight but not rigid. Her uniform was worn with familiarity rather than pride. When she spoke, her voice carried easily, not raised, not sharp. She did not pace, she did not threaten. She explained. She told us we were prisoners of war under international law. She told us the Geneva Convention applied. She outlined what that meant in precise terms. Food, shelter, medical care, work assignments. There were consequences for violations. There were also protections. Then she said the words that none of us had prepared for. "You are prisoners," she said, "but you are protected." The sentence landed unevenly, like a phrase translated too literally. Protected by whom? From what? We exchanged glances, unsure how to place it. Protection was not something enemies offered. Protection was something you demanded from those you trusted. She continued without emphasis, as if the statement required no explanation. This was the system. This was how it functioned. Questions could be asked through proper channels. Complaints would be recorded. Abuse would not be tolerated. From guards or prisoners alike, the rules were read aloud. Then they were read again, slower. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was embellished. The clarity itself felt suspicious. Later, as we were shown the barracks, I noticed how ordinary everything was. Bunks with blankets folded to regulation corners. Windows that opened. a stove that would be lit when the temperature dropped, a medical room stocked with supplies I recognized by name. Real supplies. Not the dwindling remnants we had grown used to, but replacements waiting their turn. The doctor who examined us did so with practiced efficiency. He checked pulses, asked questions, made notes. When he discovered an infection on one woman's arm, he frowned, not in anger but in concentration, and called for antibiotics. He did not ask how it happened. He did not accuse. He treated it as a problem to be solved. This, too, was unsettling. We met others over the following days, people who did not fit the enemy we had been taught to expect. A village teacher who came to discuss work assignments spoke to us the way she might speak to temporary staff, firm but fair. She looked us in the eye when she spoke. She expected us to understand instructions, and she assumed we would try to do the work well. The camp commandant, we learned, had been a nurse during the First War. She moved through the camp with a familiarity that came from having seen worse places, worse systems. When she spoke about discipline, it was not as a threat, but as a necessity. Order, she explained, protected everyone. Chaos benefited no one. None of them spoke about revenge. That absence grew louder with each day. We began to notice patterns. Meals arrived on time. Not generous feasts, but sufficient, balanced, predictable. Work assignments were posted clearly. Letters home were allowed, censored but not forbidden. When a dispute arose between prisoners, it was handled with procedure, not fists. When a guard made a mistake, it was corrected. There were consequences, yes. Rules mattered, but the rules applied evenly. No one seemed interested in making examples. Slowly, reluctantly, the fear began to change shape. It did not disappear. It loosened. It shifted from a tight, constant pressure into something more tentative. Confusion, perhaps, or disbelief. We kept waiting for the cruelty that would justify this order, for the moment when structure revealed itself as a weapon. Instead, structure remained structure. Only later did we begin to understand the scale of what we were witnessing. The interpreter mentioned numbers one afternoon, almost casually. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners, he said, housed across the Allied nations. In America alone, more than 400,000. Fed, guarded, counted. Not hidden away in some remote corner, but integrated into a system that extended across a continent. America, we were told, was fighting in Europe and the Pacific at the same time. Ships crossed oceans loaded with men and machines. Factories worked day and night. Food moved not only to soldiers at the front, but to allies, to civilians, to camps like ours. The idea was impossible to grasp. In Germany, we had felt the war narrowing. Choices reduced, resources shrinking, options disappearing. Here, the war seemed to expand outward, supported by something vast and unseen. There was no triumph in how this was explained, no boasting. It was simply fact, delivered with the same tone used to describe supply schedules or weather. We began to see that this was not kindness performed for effect. No one asked us to be grateful. No one sought approval. The guards did not lecture us about democracy. The officers did not frame their actions as moral victories. They behaved as if the system itself were the point. That realization unsettled me, more than hostility would have. Because if this order was real, if it was not a mask, not a trick, then it meant something fundamental about the people who had built it. It meant they believed rules could restrain power, that law could survive war, that even enemies were still human enough to be managed rather than crushed. At night, lying on my bunk, I listened to the quiet of the camp. Not the tense quiet of fear, but the regulated quiet of routine. Somewhere, a guard's boots crossed gravel. A door closed softly. The stove clicked as it cooled. Nothing dramatic happened. I realized how much of my strength had been spent waiting for violence. Others felt it too. I saw it in the way shoulders lowered, just slightly. In the way women began to speak more freely, their voices no longer locked behind whispers. In the way we started to notice small details. The weather, the way light moved across the yard, the sound of birds beyond the fence. We did not trust this order yet. Trust would take longer. But for the first time since capture, fear was no longer the only thing holding us together. Confusion had entered the space it left behind, and confusion, unlike terror, invited questions. If this was how they treated prisoners, what did that say about the country beyond the wire? If this was their system under the strain of total war, what did it look like in peace? The rules did not answer these questions. They did something more dangerous. They made the questions possible. Work began without ceremony. No announcements, no speeches about rehabilitation or reconciliation. A list was posted. Names matched to tasks, hours set, expectations clear. We were escorted to the village in small groups and returned the same way. The routine settled quickly, the way routines do when they make sense. Some of us were assigned to the school, others to community, services, cleaning, organizing supplies, tending gardens that had been neglected while men were away at war. We wore the same uniforms, the same worn coats, but the work was ordinary. Sweeping floors, sorting books, helping children with sums they could not quite grasp. It was the kind of work that required attention, not obedience. Competence mattered more than submission. At first, we kept our distance. We spoke only when necessary. We followed instructions exactly. We did not improvise. Years of caution do not vanish because a fence opens. The children were different. They stared openly without calculation. Some asked questions. Some simply watched. They did not know the words enemy or prisoner the way adults did. To them, we were women who helped tie shoes, who corrected handwriting, who reached for chalk when the board ran out of space. They adjusted quickly the way children always do when the world refuses to conform to adult categories. By the second week, the work no longer felt like a test. It felt like work. I found myself teaching arithmetic to a group of younger students, guiding fingers along the page, showing them how to break a problem into smaller parts. My accent slowed me, forced me to choose words carefully. They waited without impatience. One girl corrected my pronunciation of a place name with solemn authority. Another laughed when I laughed at myself. In the afternoons, we helped organize supplies. Paper was precious. Pencils were sharpened and resharpened until there was almost nothing left to hold. Nothing was wasted, but nothing was dramatized either. Scarcity existed without panic. Order existed without force. The Americans, British in this village, did not hover. They supervised, yes, but from a distance that assumed we were capable of doing what we had been assigned. Trust was not announced. It was practiced. The moment that changed everything arrived without warning. It was late morning. The yard behind the school was busy with children released for a brief break. I was standing near the doorway, speaking quietly with another woman about a lesson plan, when the sound cut through the air. A sharp cry, followed by the unmistakable sound of a body hitting ground too hard. The child, a small girl, no more than 5, had fallen near the edge of the yard. She sat stunned for a second, as children do. Then the pain caught up to her. Blood ran down her knee, bright against pale skin. The cry that followed was pure and unfiltered, the sound of surprise turning into fear. I moved before I thought. My body recognized the situation faster than my mind could catch up. I crossed the yard in a few steps and knelt beside her, my hands already assessing, already checking for something worse. She tried to pull away, frightened by the uniform, by the unfamiliar voice. I spoke softly, instinctively in the simplest English I could manage. Not commands, reassurance. "It's all right. Stay still. Let me see." The cut was deep but clean. Painful, not dangerous. I pressed gently above the wound to slow the bleeding, my fingers steady, practiced. I asked for water. Someone brought it immediately. I asked for cloth. It appeared. The speed startled me even as I worked. The child's sobs softened as I spoke to her, not about the injury, but about her shoe, about the ribbon in her hair, about how brave she was being without needing to be brave at all. I cleaned the wound carefully, apologizing each time she flinched, explaining what I was doing as if explanation itself could make it less frightening. When the teachers arrived, breathless, I looked up only long enough to give instructions. She should not walk on it yet. It needs a proper bandage. Keep it clean. Watch for swelling. They did not interrupt. They did not pull me away. They watched. When I finished, the child's breathing had steadied. Her tears slowed to hiccups. I helped her stand, supporting her weight until she found her balance. She looked at me with wet eyes, then wrapped her arms around my neck with the sudden, complete trust only children offer. I froze for a second, then returned the embrace, gently, aware of eyes on us. "Thank you," one of the teachers said, her voice quiet, not formal, not suspicious. I nodded. There was nothing else to say. Later, as the child was taken inside, the woman in charge of the school approached me. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply met my eyes. "Are you trained?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Nurse." She nodded once. "Good," she said. "We're glad you're here." That was all. No report was filed, no warning issued, no reminder of boundaries. The incident was treated as what it was: a child who fell, a woman who helped, a problem resolved. The Americans did not congratulate themselves. They did not turn the moment into proof of anything. They returned to their tasks with the same steady rhythm as before. Kindness did not require commentary. For us, the effect was profound. The story spread quickly among the women, not as rumor, but as confirmation. The fear we had carried, that helping too much would be punished, that competence would be exploited, began to loosen its grip. We had acted without permission, without hesitation, and nothing terrible had followed. More than that, something good had. The days that followed felt different, though nothing had changed on the surface. Conversations lengthened. Instructions became discussions. The teacher asked for input on lessons. We suggested activities that required fewer materials, that relied on observation rather than textbooks. She listened. Some ideas were accepted, others were not. The process itself mattered more than the outcome. In the afternoons, children began to greet us by name. Not all of them. Enough to notice. One boy brought me a stone he had found, smooth and striped, and insisted I keep it because it looked important. A girl asked me how to say her name in German and practiced until she could pronounce it correctly. The Americans allowed this to happen. They did not tighten supervision. They did not withdraw privileges. They watched, assessed, and, most striking of all, did nothing to stop it. Trust, we learned, could be extended without ceremony. It could exist quietly, reinforced by routine rather than declaration. I began to notice small changes in myself. the way my shoulders settled when I walked through the village, the way my thoughts drifted toward the work instead of the wire, the way fear no longer dictated every decision. It did not vanish. It receded, making room for something else. Responsibility. We were expected to do the work well, not to perform gratitude, not to demonstrate reform, simply to be competent and humane in the tasks assigned to us. The simplicity of the expectation was disarming. One afternoon, as we prepared to leave, the woman from the school paused beside me. She gestured toward the yard where the children were lining up. "You did the right thing," she said, as if the matter were still open for discussion. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Children are children," I said finally, the words coming from somewhere deeper than language. She nodded. "Yes," she said. "They are." That was the closest thing to agreement we ever needed. In the evenings back in the camp, we spoke about the day with a different tone. Not hushed, reflective. We talked about lessons that had gone well, about tasks completed efficiently, about how strange it felt to be trusted again. Someone laughed, a real laugh, surprised by its own sound. For the first time since capture, we were not measuring ourselves against fear. We were measuring ourselves against work. And in that quiet exchange, no speeches, no performances, no declarations, we began to understand something essential about the people who held us. They did not need to prove their morality. They lived it, the way one lives a habit learned long ago, without thinking to name it. The kindness we encountered was not dramatic. It did not ask to be witnessed. It existed alongside rules, alongside fences, alongside war itself. It assumed that competence and humanity could coexist, that strength did not require cruelty to sustain it. That realization settled slowly, like something earned rather than given. And once it took hold, it became impossible to ignore. The realization did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, gathered quietly over days that looked ordinary from the outside. It came in the weight of bread handed across a counter without ceremony, in the way shopkeepers counted ration coupons carefully, not desperately, in the way people queued without shouting, without shoving, without the edge we had been warned would define them. England had not collapsed. America, whose shadow stretched everywhere in supplies and systems, had not collapsed either. Whatever shortages existed, whatever grief and fatigue weighed on these places, they functioned. They endured. The lie did not shatter with a single blow. It dissolved, piece by piece, until there was nothing solid left to defend. I felt it one morning as we walked through the village on an errand for the school. We passed the butcher, the baker, the small shop that sold household goods arranged with careful restraint. There was meat, limited but present, bread, cut precisely, soap, paper. Not abundance, but order, the kind of order that comes from planning rather than fear. A woman ahead of us stopped to let an elderly man pass. She smiled, not because she was happy, but because courtesy was habit. The gesture was small. It should not have mattered, but it did. In the world we had been taught to expect, civility was a luxury long abandoned. Here, it persisted. I thought of the broadcasts we had listened to late at night, voices confident and unyielding, describing enemy cities in flames, populations on the verge of revolt, societies tearing themselves apart. Those voices had not mentioned this quiet persistence, this refusal to unravel. The contradiction became unbearable. If England and America were meant to be starving, broken, desperate, then what were we walking through each day? What was this place where children still learned, where bells still marked time, where people planned gardens for a future they believed they would reach. The answer formed slowly, reluctantly, in the space where certainty once lived. We had been lied to, not exaggerated to, not misled by accident. Lied to, deliberately, repeatedly, with purpose. The war we carried in our minds, the one built on inevitability and moral superiority, could not survive contact with this reality. It cracked under the weight of simple observation. The day the news came, the village changed. It arrived in the morning, carried in hurried voices and hurried footsteps. By midday, flags appeared where none had hung before. The church bell rang again, but this time it did not mark the hour. It rang and rang, joyful and unrestrained. People gathered in the streets. Some laughed openly. Some cried without embarrassment. Strangers embraced. Music appeared, as if from nowhere. Victory in Europe. We were at the school when it was announced. Someone turned on a radio. The words came through clearly, unmistakably. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For a moment, no one spoke. Outside, the village erupted. Cheers echoed down the street. The sound was overwhelming, a release of tension stored for years. Doors opened, windows filled with faces. The celebration moved like a tide, unstoppable and deserved. Inside the classroom, we stood apart. I watched the British women, teachers, aides, mothers react to the news. Relief washed over them first, then joy, then a kind of disbelief that followed too closely to be separated. They deserved this moment. I knew that. Every instinct I had left told me it was right that they celebrate, and yet my body did not know how to respond. My country had fallen. Whatever remained of my home, my city, my family, my past, was now subject to occupation, to judgment, to an uncertain future. Victory meant safety for them. It meant loss for us. The two truths existed at once, incompatible and inseparable. One of the women beside me turned away, pressing a hand to her mouth. Another stared at the floor, her face carefully blank. No one needed to speak to know what the others were thinking. We were surrounded by joy we could not share, grief we could not explain. The head teacher looked at us, then at the window, then back again. She hesitated, the celebration audible just beyond the glass. "Come," she said quietly. "Let's go inside." We moved to an empty classroom at the back of the building. The sounds of celebration continued outside. Laughter, singing, the bells still ringing, but they were muted now, held at a distance. Chairs were pulled into a loose circle. Someone closed the door gently, as if noise itself were something that could be handled with care. We sat. No one attempted to justify the victory. No one offered condolences that would ring hollow. The silence between us was heavy, but not hostile. It was the silence of people who understood that words would fail. After a long moment, one of the women spoke. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "My sister lives in Dresden," she said. "I do not know if her house still stands." Another nodded. "Hamburg," she said. "There's nothing left." I thought of my own family, scattered by years of war, letters arriving sporadically, then not at all. I thought of streets I had known by heart, now likely unrecognizable or gone. Victory did not erase those images. It sharpened them. The teacher across from me folded her hands in her lap. "My husband is still missing," she said. "In Burma. We were told this morning he is alive. That is all we know." No one responded. No one needed to. In that room, the war did not belong to one side. It belonged to all of us. The losses did not cancel each other out. They sat side by side, unranked, unmeasured. Outside, the singing grew louder. Someone began dancing in the street. Life, freed from restraint, rushed forward. Inside, we waited. There was no attempt to persuade us of anything. No one demanded gratitude. No one demanded remorse. The victory was theirs, and they did not need us to validate it. The grief was ours, and they did not try to diminish it. That restraint mattered. It was there, in that quiet room, that the last remnants of the lie finally collapsed. Not because anyone argued against it, but because no argument was necessary. The people we had been taught to fear did not seek to humiliate us in our defeat. They did not require our suffering to complete their triumph. They allowed both to exist. Later, when we walked back through the village, the celebration had settled into something gentler. Families gathered at tables pulled into the street. Children waved flags with careless enthusiasm. An old man wiped his eyes and laughed at himself for doing so. The war had ended, and they were still themselves. No one looked at us with triumph. A woman caught my eye as we passed. She hesitated, then nodded. Not a gesture of victory, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. I returned it before I could stop myself. In that small exchange, something shifted permanently. The war, we had been taught, required hatred to function. It required the enemy to be monstrous, irredeemable, less than human. That version of the war could not survive this moment. It had no place here, among people who celebrated without cruelty and mourned without spectacle. I understood then that defeat did not have to mean destruction of dignity. That victory did not require the enemy to be crushed beyond recognition. The silence of that afternoon stayed with me long after the bells stopped ringing. It was the sound of an old certainty breaking apart. And in the space it left behind, something far more difficult and far more honest began to take its place. The change did not announce itself. There was no single moment when I decided to think differently, no dramatic reversal that could be traced to a date or a sentence. What happened was slower and in some ways more unsettling. The old explanations stopped working. The ideas that had once organized the world no longer fit what I saw each day. And when an idea stops working, it does not disappear quietly. It leaves a hollow behind. In the weeks after the surrender, time seemed to loosen. The work continued. The routines held. We were still prisoners, still escorted, still counted. But the urgency that had once defined everything was gone. The war that had justified so much, fear, cruelty, obedience, had ended, and what remained had to stand on its own. I began to think back, not to the fighting, but to the structure of it all. We had been told that Germany was strong because it was disciplined, that obedience created efficiency, that fear produced order. We believed that ideology could substitute for reality, that conviction alone could overcome shortages, mistakes, even human limits. But what I had seen in England, and what I now understood about America, told a different story. These countries had not won because they were more ruthless. They had won because their systems held under pressure, because rules mattered even when no one was watching, because power was restrained by habit, by law, by a belief that structure existed to serve people rather than consume them. I thought about the camp again, about the clarity of its rules, the predictability of its routines. No one had needed to remind us constantly that we were prisoners. The system did that quietly, without humiliation. Authority did not shout because it did not need to. That realization was uncomfortable. In Germany, authority had been loud. It had demanded affirmation, demanded loyalty, demanded visible submission. It had required enemies to exist so that obedience could feel necessary. Fear had been the glue that held it together. Here, fear was not the foundation. I began to notice how often Americans, and the British alongside them, spoke about logistics, about schedules, about supplies, about procedures that sounded dull until you realized what they supported. Ships arriving on time. Factories producing not just weapons, but uniforms, medical equipment, food. Railways coordinated so that nothing sat idle for long. They talked about it the way farmers talk about weather, not as triumph, but as responsibility. The scale of it was difficult to comprehend. While fighting in Europe and the Pacific, America had also taken on the burden of feeding and housing not only its own soldiers, but allies, refugees, and prisoners. Hundreds of thousands of men who had fought against them were now eating food, grown, processed, and delivered by the same system that armed the front lines. That contradiction should have broken something. Instead, it worked. He realized then that what I was witnessing was not generosity in the sentimental sense. It was capacity. Economic, organizational, moral. A belief that winning a war did not absolve a nation of its obligations. That strength included restraint. That law did not end when it became inconvenient. Germany had produced ideology with remarkable efficiency. It had produced slogans, certainty, and enemies, but it had not produced enough food, not enough fuel, not enough room for doubt. It had replaced planning with belief, complexity with obedience. America produced machines, planes, trucks, ships, but it also produced margins, redundancy, flexibility, the ability to absorb shock without breaking. It produced enough to fight, enough to feed, enough to enforce rules without cruelty. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it produced a confidence that did not need constant affirmation. No one here demanded that we admire them. No one asked us to agree. They did not require conversion to validate their system. They allowed it to speak for itself. That silence was persuasive. One afternoon, I stood at the edge of the schoolyard watching the children tend the small garden we had helped organize. They worked without urgency, kneeling in the dirt, arguing about whose turn it was to water, laughing when someone splashed too much. The vegetables were modest, the rows imperfect. Still, the plants grew. It struck me that this too was part of the war effort. Not the garden itself, but the confidence behind it. The belief that teaching children how to grow food mattered even while the world was burning. That investment in the future was not postponed until after victory, but carried alongside it. We had been taught that war required total focus, total obedience, total sacrifice of anything not immediately useful. Here, usefulness was defined more broadly. Education continued. Communities functioned. Moral habits were maintained. Victory, I began to understand, was not only a matter of defeating an enemy. It was a matter of preserving what made defeat worth surviving. The thought unsettled me because it left little room for the story I had lived inside for years. If America had won because it could outproduce, out-organize, and out-endure us, that was one thing. But if it had won because it refused to abandon its moral structure, even when dealing with enemies, that was something else entirely. That meant we had not been defeated by brutality. We had been defeated by a system that worked. The words formed slowly, reluctantly, as I tried to articulate them to myself. They didn't break us. They made us question everything we were taught. That question was not comfortable. It did not come with easy answers. It forced me to revisit moments I had accepted without scrutiny, to reconsider explanations I had never allowed myself to doubt. It forced me to acknowledge how much fear had shaped my obedience, how much certainty had been borrowed rather than earned. The Americans did not ask for this reckoning. They did not guide it. They did not even know it was happening. They simply maintained their system. And that, I realized, was the most powerful argument of all. Because systems built on fear require constant enforcement. Systems built on law and habit endure without spectacle. They create space for people, even enemies, to change their minds. I did not become an admirer overnight. I did not forget what the war had taken from me, from my country, from my family. Moral awakening is not conversion. It is recognition. Recognition that strength and cruelty are not the same thing. Recognition that victory does not excuse inhumanity. Recognition that the measure of a nation is found not only in how it treats its own, but in how it treats those who once tried to destroy it. That recognition stayed with me. It followed me back through the camp gates each evening into the quiet of the barracks, into the long hours of thought that came when the noise of war finally receded. It did not offer comfort. It offered clarity. And clarity, once gained, is difficult to surrender. America had not defeated us by proving us weak. It had done something far more unsettling. It had shown us another way to be strong. We left quietly. There were no crowds, no ceremonies marking our departure. A lorry arrived at dawn, its engine idling softly at the edge of the camp. Names were called, papers checked. We gathered what few belongings we had accumulated. Letters, a photograph, a stone given by a child, small things that felt heavier than they should. As the gate opened, I looked back once. The wire was still there. The guard posts remained, but beyond them the village lay unchanged, roofs catching, the early light, chimneys smoking gently, a world already moving forward. It struck me that this place would continue whether we remembered it or not. That, somehow, made the memory stronger. The journey home was long. We passed through processing centers, then ports, then the slow crossing back to a continent that had forgotten how to look whole. Germany greeted us in fragments. Cities reduced to outlines. Streets renamed by absence. Buildings standing only long enough to show where something else had once been. I found my sister alive, living in a cellar with other families, surviving on routines as strict as any camps. Others were not so fortunate. Some women returned to towns that no longer existed except on paper. Hamburg was rubble. Dresden was silence layered on silence. The defeat we had imagined during captivity was real, and worse than we had pictured. And yet, something inside us had changed. We spoke of England rarely at first. The stories felt unreal against the scale of destruction around us. Breadlines did not leave much room for reflection. Rebuilding required attention. Survival demanded focus. But memory has a way of waiting. Months later, when life had settled into something like rhythm, letters began to circulate. Not many. Paper was scarce, postage uncertain. But they arrived, sometimes months late, creased and opened by authorities who no longer frightened us. I wrote one myself. I thanked the teacher who had supervised our work, though I did not know if the letter would ever reach her. I told her we had survived the journey, that my sister was alive, that I had returned to nursing where I could. I did not speak of politics. I did not speak of forgiveness. I spoke only of memory. Others wrote, too. Brief notes, careful words, gratitude expressed without drama, without obligation. No one asked to be absolved. No one pretended the war had not happened. What we carried back was not affection. It was clarity. Years passed. Germany rebuilt unevenly, painfully. Factories returned. Schools reopened. Children grew into adults who asked questions we had not dared to ask when we were their age. When they asked us about the war, about captivity, we chose our words carefully. We told them about hunger and fear, yes, about loss, about mistakes that could not be undone. But we also told them about a village that had not been destroyed, about rules that protected enemies, about a country strong enough to feed those who had tried to defeat it. Some listened skeptically. Some were surprised. A few were moved. I kept the photograph from the schoolyard in a drawer with important papers. It faded over time, but the shapes remained. Children clustered around women in worn uniforms, a garden behind them, the suggestion of order and patience in the arrangement. When I looked at it, I did not think of captivity. I thought of restraint. Across the ocean, America changed too. From a distance, we watched it become something larger, more complex. The unity that had carried it through the war softened into argument, then hardened again into division. The factories that had once worked day and night for a shared purpose slowed, shifted, disappeared. The certainty of common cause faded into debate about what that cause had been. From where I stood, it was not decline that struck me. It was forgetting. Not forgetting the war, but forgetting what had mattered during it. Forgetting that strength once meant responsibility, that power had been paired with rules, that victory had not required humiliation of the defeated. I did not judge this change. Nations, like people, grow restless when they no longer remember what held them together. But I wondered how many remembered that their grandparents' greatness had not come from loud certainty, but from quiet discipline, from doing the necessary work without needing to be admired for it. When I spoke to Americans years later, some through letters, some through brief meetings, I noticed something familiar in their questions. They wanted to know if it was true, if their country had really been like that, if the stories their grandparents told were more than nostalgia. I answered honestly, yes, it had been real, not perfect, not gentle in every way, but guided by something steadier than anger, something that did not need to announce itself to be effective. History, I learned, remembers who won wars, but people remember who treated enemies like humans. That memory does not fade easily. It survives the collapse of buildings and the erosion of certainty. It travels quietly, carried by those who experienced it and passed on without embellishment. I am an old woman now. The world I knew is gone, replaced by one that moves faster than I ever imagined. But when I think back on the war, on everything it took and everything it taught, one image remains clearer than any other. 6 women in gray uniforms walking through a village that should not have existed, a bell ringing without fear, a child holding out a stone and calling it important. That was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of understanding what victory could mean. And some victories, those built on restraint, dignity, and quiet decency, do not fade. They wait, patiently, for someone to remember why they mattered.